Under a sky the colour of bruised steel, the ruins of Krieg whispered their last laments. Towers that once scraped the heavens now leaned like ancient gravestones, their skeletal frames reaching upward as if begging some distant god for mercy. The air was heavy with the scent of ash and the acrid sting of chemical rot, a breath of poison that seemed to seep not only into the lungs, but into the soul itself. Here, the heart of a once proud world had stopped beating. The streets, once alive with the march of parades and the ringing of industry, were empty save for the wind, which carried with it the soft hiss of dust sliding through broken glass. It was a dead sound, the kind that made men feel small and fleeting in the shadow of eternity. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. On the jagged edge of a collapsed highway, a lone figure stood, his greatcoat flapping in the cold, chemical wind. His face was hidden behind a rebreather mask, its lenses catching the faint light like a predator's eyes in the dark. Beneath the mask, his jaw was tight, his breath slow and measured. Captain Eric Voss had been born in a city that no longer existed, raised in streets now buried under 100 meters of rubble and corpses. Yet in his memory, they still breathed. The smell of iron and oil from the manufactorums, the proud banners snapping in the wind during the Emperor's Day parades, the soft voice of his mother singing him to sleep as the smog outside thickened. Those memories were all that was left of home. Around him, the last survivors of Krieg's 143rd Regiment stood in grim silence. They had fought without sleep for 3 days, holding the eastern barricades against traitor forces that had poured through the cracks in Krieg's crumbling defences. The enemy had once been their own, citizens, soldiers, politicians who had turned from the Emperor's light to embrace rebellion. Civil war had burned through the heart of the planet like a plague, and now the infection had reached its final stage. The loyalists could not win. Not anymore. The order had come through the secure Vox line hours ago. Voss had listened to the message 3 times in the cold glow of a failing lumen lamp, the words as sharp as a blade and twice as deep in their cut. There would be no reinforcements, no retreat, no survival. Krieg was lost. The only option remaining was to ensure that nothing here could ever be of use to the enemy again. The men around him knew what this meant. They had not flinched when the order was read aloud. Their faces, hidden behind gas masks and shaded goggles, showed no fear, no hesitation. Krieg's soldiers had been forged in obedience, tempered in faith. They were not fighting for themselves, nor even for the city. They fought for the Emperor, and the Emperor demanded sacrifice. Yet Voss hesitated. The bomb codes lay in his pocket, a small brass key that could awaken the weapons sealed deep beneath the city. Nuclear warheads slumbering in their silos since the days when Krieg's enemies had been alien invaders instead of their own kin. He could feel its weight pressing against his thigh like a lead ingot, dragging at him with every step. It was not fear of death that gave him pause. Death was a certainty. He had made peace with that long ago. It was the knowledge that by turning the key, he would erase everything. Millions of lives, loyalists, rebels, children, burned away in an instant of blinding light. A distant thunder rolled across the horizon, and the ground beneath his boots shuddered. The rebel artillery had begun again, methodical as a drumbeat, each shell smashing into the outer ruins with the inevitability of the tide. The sky flashed briefly with fire, and he imagined for a moment that he could hear the screams carried on the wind. His second-in-command approached, Lieutenant Marin, a gaunt man whose voice rasped from too many years breathing through a filter clogged with ash. "Sir," he said, his tone as flat as the wastes, "the western barricades are gone. They'll be here within the hour." Voss turned to face him, the lenses of his mask catching the reflection of the distant fires. "How many civilians remain?" "Civilians?" Marin gave a faint shake of his head. "None, sir. Those who could flee, fled. The rest—" He did not finish. He didn't need to. Voss looked back toward the horizon, where the faint silhouette of the capital's spire still stood, a black needle stabbing upward into the poison clouds. Once it had been the pride of the planet, a testament to Krieg's loyalty and strength. Now it was a tombstone. The lieutenant waited in silence, the unspoken question hanging between them. Should we turn the key? Should we end it? Voss's gloved hand brushed against the brass in his pocket. He thought of the Emperor, not as the distant god-figure the Ministorum preached, but as the ideal he had been raised to serve, the embodiment of duty, of sacrifice, of unyielding will. He thought of the rebels, their banners mocking the imperial Aquila, their voices calling for freedom from the Imperium's rule. And he thought of the generations yet unborn, who might inherit not this broken, poisoned world, but its shame. The choice was simple in the language of war, but war was never just war. The rumble of artillery drew closer, louder, shaking the broken buildings until shards of glass clinked down from their jagged frames. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly before being silenced by another explosion. Voss lifted his head and looked to his men. They stood at attention, silent and still, their bodies cloaked in ash, their rifles clutched like extensions of their own bones. They were ready. His voice, when it came, was calm. "Prepare the charges." There was no cheer, no cry of affirmation. The men simply moved to obey, as if they had been waiting for this command their entire lives. Perhaps they had. As the soldiers dispersed into the ruins, Voss remained where he stood, watching the horizon. The clouds above swirled slowly, their dark bellies heavy with poison. Somewhere far beyond this sky, the Emperor's light still shone, untouched by the filth of this world. That light was worth dying for, and so Krieg would die. The wind howled through the empty corridors of the governor's palace, rattling loose shutters and dragging the stink of smoke into the once regal chambers. Beneath the cracked marble floors, the bones of forgotten leaders lay buried in tombs that would soon share their fate with the living above. The palace had been the heart of Krieg's rule for centuries, ornate, unshakable, and proud. But now its gold-leafed arches were blackened by fire, its stained glass windows shattered into shards that glimmered like dying embers in the half-light. Captain Eric Voss walked its halls with the heavy step of a man who had come not as a guest, but as a witness to its rot. The Civil War had not yet reached its final hour, but the decay within these walls had begun long before the first shot was fired. The ruling council had become a circle of whisperers and plotters, its chambers filled with the rustle of secret deals and the soft click of knives sliding free from their sheaths. They argued about tariffs while artillery shells pounded the outskirts, debated ancient legal codes while citizens bled in the streets. It was here, in these rooms, that Krieg had been betrayed long before the rebels ever raised their banners. At the far end of the Hall of Iron Banners, Governor Albrecht's voice echoed off the cracked stone. He was an aging man whose rich uniform could not hide the frailty in his frame. Once a war hero, now a shadow of that title, he stood before the council table with shaking hands, "We must negotiate," he declared, his voice thin but urgent. "If we continue on this path, the capital will be ash within the month. The Imperium cannot afford to lose an entire world to its own stubbornness." Voss stood in the shadow of a broken column, his expression hidden behind the dull, round lenses of his mask. Negotiate. The word curled in his mind like a parasite. The rebels had made their intentions plain from the beginning. They would not bow to the Emperor. They would sell Krieg's soul to the highest bidder, whether that bidder was a Xenos merchant empire or the ruinous whispers from beyond the veil. To offer them terms was to sign away not just the planet's sovereignty, but its very purpose. Lieutenant Marin shifted beside him, his posture rigid, his gloved hands clenched tight. "They're not talking to the rebels," he murmured quietly, his voice barely audible under the whistle of wind through the shattered glass. "They're talking to the other governors. They're preparing to abandon the loyalists entirely." At the table, one of the councillors, a tall, elegant woman with the cold smile of a knife, leaned forward. "If we surrender, we can preserve our infrastructure, spare the cities from destruction, and perhaps in time, we can rejoin the Imperium on more favourable terms." Her tone was smooth, polished. It was treason spoken like a lullaby. The governor's eyes shifted to Voss, as though expecting him to add his voice to the discussion. "Captain," he said, "you've seen the front lines. Tell us, do we have the strength to win this war?" Voss stepped forward slowly, his boots clicking on the fractured marble. The council members' eyes followed him like carrion birds tracking a dying animal. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "No," he said, "we do not have the strength to win, but we have the will to deny them their prize, and that is worth more than victory." A murmur swept through the chamber. Some faces hardened with disapproval, others with unease. The elegant woman's smile did not falter, but her eyes sharpened. "You speak like a fanatic," she said. "Would you burn our own people to preserve a symbol?" Voss did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the governor. "I would burn everything to preserve our loyalty to the Emperor. If the rebels take this world alive, it will be a cancer in the heart of the Imperium for generations. Better it be ash than a traitor's crown." The governor's shoulders sagged, and he turned away without another word. The council dissolved into hushed arguments, their voices rising and falling in waves. But Voss no longer listened. He had heard all of it before, in 100 variations. There were no loyal hearts here, only opportunists measuring the value of surrender against the risk of defiance. As he left the chamber, Marin fell into step beside him. "They'll betray us outright before long," the lieutenant said. "They already have," Voss replied. In the streets beyond the palace, the city was crumbling in slow motion. Civilians moved like wraiths through the smog, their faces pale and hollow-eyed, clutching bundles of possessions that were pitiful shields against what was coming. Loyalist soldiers patrolled in silence, their boots muffled by layers of ash that lay over the cobblestones like snow. Above them, the sun was little more than a faint disk, smothered by the chemical haze. At a barricade near the old Manufactorum district, Voss paused to watch the troops at work. They were reinforcing the walls with scavenged steel and sandbags, their movements mechanical, precise. Among them was a man Voss recognized, Sergeant Calden, a veteran whose family had served the Imperial Guard for 4 generations. His armor was dented and blackened from months of fighting, but his eyes still held a sharpness that defied exhaustion. "Captain," Calden greeted him with a curt nod. "We held the district last night, but they'll try again before dawn. We're short on ammunition and rations, but we'll hold." Voss studied him for a long moment. There was no false optimism in the sergeant's voice, no illusion of victory, only the quiet certainty of a man prepared to die for the cause. It was that quality, more than weapons or walls, that kept the loyalists standing. As night fell, the distant thunder of artillery began again. The sound rolled through the city like the growl of some vast, unseen beast. Voss returned to his quarters in a half-collapsed hab block, its walls patched with sheet metal and canvas. There, by the dim glow of a single lumen lamp, he began to write. His words were not a battle report, nor an official communique. They were a record, a testament, for whoever might one day find the ruins of Krieg and wonder why it had burned itself to nothing. He wrote of the council's corruption, of the soldiers' unwavering loyalty, of the civilians who had been abandoned by their own leaders. He wrote of the Emperor's light, distant and untouchable, and how it shone all the brighter against the darkness of treachery. By the time he laid down his pen, the bombardment had grown closer, the explosions rattling the flimsy walls around him. Somewhere out in the city, another barricade had fallen. The rebels were tightening their grip, and soon the choice he feared would be upon him. Voss set the brass key on the table in front of him, its dull gleam catching the light. It was small, insignificant in weight, yet it held the fate of a world in its cold, silent teeth. He stared at it until the walls shook again, and then blew out the lamp. In the darkness, he could still feel it watching him. The night sky above Krieg was a bruised canvas, streaked with the fire trails of artillery and the slow, smothering churn of toxic clouds. From the upper floors of a shattered hab block, Captain Eric Voss could see the eastern quarter burning in the distance, its streets lit in sickly orange as rebel forces pushed deeper toward the loyalist lines. The rumble of the bombardment was constant, a dull heartbeat that never ceased, punctuated by the sharper cracks of lasfire and the muffled thump of grenades in the narrow alleys below. For 3 days and nights, the city had been locked in a brutal stalemate, with neither side willing to yield more than a street or a building at a time. Every block was fought over tooth and nail, every ruin becoming a fortress, every sewer tunnel a battlefield. Voss's men had been living in the trenches and rubble, fighting in the same gas-choked air they slept in. There were no safe zones, only areas that hadn't yet been overrun. At dawn, the fog was so thick that the shapes of nearby buildings blurred into the murk. Through it, Voss moved with a squad of the 143rd, crossing a gap between defensive lines under the cover of smoke. His mask filtered out the worst of the chemical bite in the air, but the stench of blood still found its way through. They were heading toward Manufactorum 12, an ancient industrial block now serving as the keystone of the loyalist defences in the district. If it fell, the entire sector would collapse. The Manufactorum's great steel doors were pocked with scorch marks, its walls gouged by months of fighting. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the bitter tang of spent promethium. Dozens of soldiers were crammed into the factory floor, their greatcoats stiff with grime, their helmets dented and scarred. They spoke little, their silence broken only by the dull clatter of ammunition being loaded or the scrape of bayonets against whetstones. Sergeant Calden met Voss near the assembly lines, where the rusting shells of half-finished machines stood like skeletal guardians. "Captain," he said, saluting sharply, "we held them off again last night, but they'll be back. We've spotted at least 2 rebel artillery teams setting up on the rooftops across the square." "Have the snipers dealt with them?" Voss asked. Calden shook his head. "We don't have the range, and they've dug themselves in deep. Even if we manage to take out the gunners, they'll have replacements ready. Voss scanned the factory floor. The men were exhausted, their eyes hollow behind their mask lenses, but none showed signs of breaking. That was the way of Krieg's soldiers. They did not yield to fear or despair. They simply endured until there was nothing left to endure. Still, endurance alone would not hold the manufactorum forever. As they spoke, the distant boom of heavy guns grew louder, followed by the low, rattling roar of tank engines. Voss's gaze snapped toward the main gates. The rebels were massing for another push. By mid-morning, the assault began. The first shells smashed into the outer barricades, throwing plumes of dust and shrapnel into the air. Then came the infantry, masked and armoured, their rifles spitting fire as they surged across the open square. Voss was on the line when the first wave hit, his las pistol barking in his hand, his voice cutting through the din as he directed fire along the barricades. Loyalist grenadiers hurled explosives into the advancing ranks, the blasts tearing men apart in bursts of smoke and blood. Still, the rebels pressed forward, clambering over their dead to reach the barricades. The fighting turned savage in the choke points, where the manufactorum's narrow entrances funneled the enemy into close quarters. Bayonets flashed, entrenching tools cracked against helmets, and the screams of the wounded mixed with the unrelenting roar of gunfire. Twice, the rebels breached the doors, and twice they were driven back by countercharges that left the floor slick with blood. It was during the second breach that Voss caught sight of something through the smoke. A rebel officer, directing his troops with a precision uncommon among their ranks. Even at a distance, Voss recognized him. Commander Hauer, once a decorated loyalist, now one of the rebellion's most capable leaders. Hauer had served alongside Voss years before, and there had been a time when Voss had called him brother. Seeing him here, leading men against the Emperor's will, brought a weight of betrayal heavier than any shell. For a moment, their eyes met across the chaos. There was no hesitation in Hauer's gaze, no flicker of the man Voss had known, only the cold certainty of an enemy who had chosen his path. Then the smoke thickened, and Hauer was gone. By late afternoon, the square was a graveyard. Bodies lay in heaps along the barricades, their masks cracked, their uniforms scorched. The manufactorum still stood, but the cost had been brutal. Half of Kalden's company was gone, and the survivors were running dangerously low on ammunition. As night fell, Voss walked the ruined floor, speaking to the wounded where they lay on stretchers between the rusted machines. Some clung to life with a stubbornness that mirrored the city's own refusal to die. Others had already gone silent, their final breaths hidden beneath their masks. In a quiet corner of the factory, Lieutenant Maren approached with a Vox report. "The palace is preparing for a withdrawal," he said grimly. "They're planning to abandon the outer districts entirely. The rebels will be on the central spire within the week." Voss said nothing at first, his gaze fixed on the shadows between the great steel beams. "And when the spire falls, the council will surrender," he said finally. "They'll hand Krieg over without another shot fired." Maren nodded. "Unless we act first." Voss thought of the brass key, the silos buried deep beneath the city, and the white fire waiting in the dark. The decision that had haunted him for days loomed ever closer. Every battle fought, every street defended, every life spent was only delaying the inevitable. He looked out through a shattered window at the burning horizon. The enemy's fires rose higher with each passing night, their smoke mingling with the poison clouds until the sky itself seemed to bleed. Somewhere in that darkness, Hauer was still out there, driving the knife deeper into Krieg's heart. Voss tightened his grip on his last pistol. He would hold the Manufactorum. He would hold every inch of the city he could. But when the moment came, he would not let Krieg be taken alive. And when that moment came, the world would burn. The first light of dawn barely penetrated the smog-choked sky above Krieg, casting the ruined city in a dim iron-grey hue. Smoke rose from shattered manufactorums and collapsed hab blocks like the fingers of some ancient dying giant, clawing toward a heaven that had long since turned away. Captain Erich Voss stood atop a pile of rubble near the Manufactorum district, surveying the streets below. The artillery fire from the rebels had lessened, not because they had faltered, but because the loyalists had made a choice to dig in, endure, and prepare for the next wave. Krieg did not yield. It merely waited, a patient sentinel at the edge of oblivion. In the distance, the silhouette of the governor's palace loomed, its spire fractured, its halls gutted by treachery and neglect. Voss could feel the weight of history pressing down, the ghosts of leaders past whispering of glory lost and loyalty betrayed. The council had been compromised long ago, corrupted by fear, ambition, and the faintest whiff of hope that negotiation could preserve what their faith could not. Now, the rebellion's leaders moved freely in the shadows, and the loyalist forces were left to fight alone, their numbers thinning with each passing hour. Voss descended into the Manufactorum, where soldiers of the 143rd Regiment were fortifying barricades, reloading weapons, and patching armor with whatever materials remained. Dust clung to their uniforms like a second skin, and beneath their gas masks, their eyes were weary yet unyielding. Sergeant Calden approached him, his hands coated in soot and blood. "Captain, the outer perimeter is stable for now, but our scouts report movement along the western corridors. They're testing us again. This is only the beginning." Voss nodded, his gloved hand brushing the brass key in his pocket. Every heartbeat brought it closer to use, yet he remained focused on the immediate, holding the Manufactorum, preserving the lives still entrusted to him. He could not allow the city to crumble further, not while there was still breath in his soldiers. Lieutenant Maren returned from a patrol through the upper floors, his visor fogged with the residue of chemical fire. "We've spotted them preparing siege engines," he said quietly. "They're not just probing. They're positioning to bring the building down completely." The thought made Voss's chest tighten. Siege engines meant indiscriminate destruction, lives lost in numbers that could not be counted. And yet, the Emperor demanded obedience, demanded sacrifice. The Loyalists would endure, as they always had. Hours passed in tense preparation. Voss moved from barricade to barricade, speaking briefly with each group of soldiers, offering words of encouragement that he scarcely felt. Each soldier's gaze, hardened by months of war, reflected his own grim determination. In their eyes, he saw the embodiment of Krieg itself, unyielding, relentless, and destined to die if necessary. By mid-afternoon, the assault began. Siege engines hurled molten rounds into the Manufactorum walls, splintering steel and stone. The explosions sent plumes of smoke spiraling upward, choking the streets and shrouding the battlefield in a haze. Rebel troops surged through breaches as quickly as they were made, their armor gleaming dully beneath the poisoned sun. Voss took his place at the front line, his last pistol discharging in disciplined bursts. The Loyalists fought with a mechanical precision, born of generations trained to endure the unendurable. Grenades exploded, hurling bodies across the charred floors. Screams and shouts were muffled by gas masks and the continuous thunder of artillery. It was during this chaos that Voss saw the traitor commander again, Hauer, moving through the smoke like a phantom, directing the assault with ruthless efficiency. Voss's mind briefly wavered, recalling the camaraderie they had shared years ago. The betrayal stung sharper than any last bolt, a reminder that war was never simply fought between enemies, but between ideals, loyalties, and choices. As the battle raged, Voss moved among his men, pulling wounded soldiers from under debris, directing counterattacks, and ensuring that every inch of the manufactorum was defended. Each decision was a balance between survival and duty. To falter meant death. To hesitate meant the fall of the city. Yet with every passing hour, the cost grew heavier, the burden of command almost unbearable. By nightfall, the manufactorum still stood, though its walls were battered and scorched, its floors slick with blood and oil. The surviving loyalists tended to the wounded, their hands shaking but resolute. Voss retreated to a small observation deck above the factory floor, surveying the ruined streets and distant fires. Somewhere beyond the smoke, he could hear the faint rumble of Hauer's forces regrouping for another assault. Maren approached silently, standing beside him. "They'll come again, sir, and they'll bring more fire this time." Voss's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll endure again. That is all we can do." He thought of the brass key, still heavy in his pocket, and of the final choice that awaited him. Krieg had already been betrayed, and soon the moment would come to decide whether the planet would live under tyranny or die in a blaze of loyalty. Every street defended, every life sacrificed, was preparation for that day. The men of Krieg would endure to the very last, and if necessary, they would carry the city into the flames themselves. Above the ruins, the poison clouds churned, and in their roiling depths, the first hints of night's shadow began to creep across the ash-laden streets. Krieg waited, and so did Voss. The world was on the brink, and the final chapter of its loyalty had yet to be written. The early morning light cut through the poisoned haze of Krieg like a dull blade, scattering shards of fire across the broken streets. Captain Eric Voss moved through the debris-laden avenues, his boots crunching over shattered masonry and scorched metal. The city was a ruin built upon ruins, and each step reminded him that Krieg's history was etched in cycles of fire, loyalty, and blood. The air carried a metallic tang, mingled with smoke and the faint, lingering odor of charred flesh. Here, the past and present bled together, a mirror of the choices yet to come. The manufactorum district had become a stronghold, a crucible in which the last loyalists tested their resolve. Within its blackened walls, soldiers moved with disciplined precision, reinforcing barricades, distributing ammunition, and tending to the wounded. Their eyes, visible through soot-stained masks, reflected exhaustion and grim determination. Voss paused near the central command post, where maps and Vox lines were strewn across a steel table, charts marking the shifting front lines like scars on a body. Lieutenant Maren approached, his voice low. "Captain, the rebels are massing again. Reports indicate they've brought heavy armor through the southern corridors. They're coordinating with Hauer directly. The assault will be larger than any before." Voss's hand rested on the brass key in his pocket, the metal cool against his palm. He thought of the nuclear silos buried deep beneath the city, the fire waiting to be unleashed. Every instinct screamed to act, yet he held back. Krieg was not yet finished. The loyalists still clung to hope, to duty, to the Emperor's light, and it was that very hope he would need to preserve until the final moment. He moved through the manufactorum, checking on squads, offering words of encouragement, issuing orders. Soldiers nodded, their masks concealing the toll of sleepless nights and unrelenting battle. They fought not for glory, nor for survival, but because their loyalty demanded it. Krieg had taught them obedience, and obedience now demanded sacrifice. By mid-morning, the first shells of the new assault struck. The earth shuddered as molten rounds splintered walls and sent fragments of steel flying across the square. Loyalist grenadiers hurled explosives into the advancing enemy, their bursts of fire carving the rebels' ranks into chaos. Despite their ferocity, the attackers pressed on, driven by Hauer's ruthless leadership and the promise of conquest. Voss took position at the front line, his last pistol spitting disciplined fire into the enemy ranks. Every movement was precise, every command measured. Soldiers fell around him, yet the line held, repelled by sheer will as much as by weaponry. He moved among the men, pulling the wounded from the debris, redirecting fire where needed, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of Hauer's approach. Amid the smoke and roar, Voss's mind drifted briefly to the brass key. The final choice it represented loomed ever closer, a reminder of the world's fragile balance between survival and annihilation. Each life he saved, each barricade reinforced, was only delaying the inevitable. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed on him, heavier than any lasbolt or shell. Hours bled into each other as the rebels continued their relentless push. Voss noted the precision of their attacks, the coordination that betrayed years of training and intimate knowledge of loyalist tactics. Hauer's betrayal was no accident. It was deliberate, meticulous, and personal. Memories of their past camaraderie flitted through Voss's mind, each one a dagger in the heart of loyalty now tested by war. By late afternoon, casualties had mounted on both sides. The manufactorum stood, battered but unbroken, a fortress of resolve amid the chaos. Soldiers moved with mechanical efficiency, their eyes hollow but unyielding. The screams of the wounded mingled with the constant thunder of artillery, a symphony of pain and endurance. Voss ascended to a vantage point, surveying the streets below. Fires from collapsed buildings cast flickering shadows, painting the ruins in hues of orange and black. Smoke twisted upward like serpents, carrying with it the cries of the dying and the distant rumble of rebel engines. Somewhere in that haze, Hauer's figure moved again, orchestrating the chaos with cold, unflinching precision. Lieutenant Maren joined him, leaning against the shattered parapet. "They'll strike again tonight," he said quietly. "Stronger, faster. They want the manufactorum gone before the weekends." Voss did not reply immediately. His gaze lingered on the horizon, on the faint glimmer of the governor's palace and the spire beyond. Every street, every barricade, every soldier was a line in the story of Krieg, a testament to loyalty under fire. And yet, the brass key remained in his pocket, a silent promise of finality. "Then we endure," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "No matter the cost." Maren nodded, and together they turned to oversee the preparations for the next assault. Each man, each life, was a thread in the fragile tapestry of Krieg's final defense. Every decision, every sacrifice would shape the legacy of a world teetering between destruction and loyalty. As dusk fell, the sky darkened with the rising smoke, the poison clouds absorbing the fires below. Krieg braced itself for another night of unrelenting war, its streets a testament to endurance, its people a monument to sacrifice. Captain Voss stood at the heart of it all, watching, waiting, and preparing for the moment when all would be decided. ChatGPT said, "Night had settled over Krieg like a shroud. thick and suffocating, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke, blood, and scorched metal. The Manufacturum district, though still standing, bore the wounds of countless assaults: shattered windows, crumbling walls, and floors slick with oil and ash. Captain Erich Voss moved through the chaos, boots crunching on debris, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Even in the darkness, Krieg was alive, its heartbeat the drum of artillery and the whispered prayers of the loyalists who still clung to the Emperor's light. In the heart of the Manufacturum, soldiers of the 143rd Regiment moved like ghosts, reinforcing barricades, tending to the wounded, and checking weapons. Their breaths, visible in the cold, poisoned air, were measured and steady. Each man and woman carried the weight of the city on their shoulders, understanding that failure meant death, not just for themselves, but for every life still unclaimed by the firestorm outside. Lieutenant Maren approached Voss, his visor fogged and smeared with the residue of chemical fire. "They're regrouping again," he whispered. "Reports indicate at least 3 squads with heavy weapons moving through the western alleys. Hauer is personally leading this push." Voss's hand brushed the brass key hidden beneath his coat. He had not yet used it, though the temptation gnawed at him with every new report of rebel movement. Krieg still had soldiers, still had barricades, still had the stubborn resolve that had preserved it through centuries. The time for final judgment had not yet arrived, but the city's pulse quickened with every approaching rebel step, and Voss knew the moment of reckoning drew near. The first volley of the assault began just past midnight. Shells screamed through the air, striking walls and sending clouds of dust and fragments into the streets. Loyalist defenders fired disciplined volleys from the barricades, their laser guns cracking in unison, cutting down the front ranks of the rebels. Explosions shook the Manufacturum, throwing soldiers from their feet and hurling debris across the factory floor. Voss moved among the men, directing fire, pulling wounded soldiers to safety and reinforcing the most vulnerable positions. The rebels pressed relentlessly, their coordination precise, their ferocity driven by Hauer's unyielding presence. Each breach was met with stubborn resistance, each advance repelled by the Loyalists' grim determination. The Manufacturum had become a crucible, testing not just strategy and skill, but the endurance of men who had been pushed beyond fear, beyond fatigue, beyond hope. Amid the chaos, Voss caught a glimpse of Hauer, moving like a shadow across the battlefield, orchestrating the assault with ruthless efficiency. The sight struck him like a blow. This was a man he had once trusted, a brother in arms now guiding death toward the very city he had once sworn to protect. The betrayal cut deeper than any last bolt, leaving a hollow ache that mingled with the roar of gunfire. Hours stretched into an endless nightmare. The Manufacturum's walls shuddered under the relentless bombardment. Soldiers fell around Voss, their bodies and spirits broken, yet the line held. Every inch of ground was defended with ferocity born not of hope, but of duty. Voss's mind, though clouded with exhaustion, remained sharp. Every decision, every command weighed heavily, balancing survival with the imperative to deny the rebels victory. By the pre-dawn hours, the assault slowed. The rebels had been repelled, but the cost was staggering. The Manufacturum's floors were slick with blood, its walls scarred and battered. Half the 143rd Regiment lay dead or dying, their sacrifice a testament to Krieg's stubborn endurance. Voss moved among the survivors, offering what words of encouragement he could, though even he felt the weight of despair pressing against his chest. In a quiet corner, Voss finally allowed himself a moment to reflect. The brass key lay heavy in his pocket, a symbol of the final decision awaiting him. The city could still endure another assault, but at what cost? Every breath, every heartbeat, every life spent in the defense of the manufactorum brought Krieg closer to a precipice from which there would be no return. Lieutenant Marin approached, his voice low and steady. "Captain, we cannot hold them forever. Hauer's forces will not tire. They'll find another weakness, another breach. When that happens..." Voss nodded, the weight of inevitability settling on him. "Then we do what we must," he said quietly. "Krieg will not fall alive into their hands. If the city dies, it will die loyal." Outside, the poison cloud swirled above the manufactorum, carrying the echoes of war through the streets. Smoke and fire mingled with the chill of night, and in the darkness, the loyalists of Krieg prepared themselves once more for the battles yet to come. Captain Voss moved among them, guiding, leading, and enduring, the brass key a constant reminder that the final choice would come soon, and that when it did, no one would walk away unscarred. The city waited, and so did Krieg's defenders. The crucible of loyalty and fire was far from over, and the dawn of reckoning approached with relentless inevitability. The sky above Krieg was a swirling mass of black clouds and crimson fire, the remnants of endless bombardment casting a hellish glow over the broken streets. Captain Erich Voss stood atop a collapsed hab block, surveying the city that had become both battlefield and tomb. Smoke twisted upward from the manufactorum district, curling in ghostly shapes that seemed to mock the loyalty of those still alive. Below, the loyalists moved like shadows among the ruins, their gas masks glinting in the flickering light of burning debris. Every street, every barricade, every man and woman was a testament to Krieg's stubborn endurance, but the weight of the rebel siege pressed ever closer, relentless and unyielding. The assault began before dawn. Heavy artillery shook the earth, splintering walls and sending shards of steel and concrete across the streets. The rebels pressed forward in waves, coordinated with a precision that spoke of Hauer's unflinching presence. Voss moved among his soldiers, his las pistol discharging in measured bursts, his voice cutting through the roar of battle as he directed defensive fire and reinforced vulnerable points. The manufactorum's walls shuddered under the relentless onslaught, and each breach was met with grim resistance, every inch of ground defended with a ferocity born of duty rather than hope. Amid the chaos, Voss glimpsed Hauer again, moving like a phantom across the battlefield, directing his troops with ruthless efficiency. The betrayal burned deeper with each encounter, a personal wound that mirrored the devastation consuming the city. Memories of camaraderie and shared victories flitted through Voss's mind, now twisted into a bitter reminder of loyalty corrupted. Hauer's eyes met his across the smoke, cold and unyielding, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed suspended between past and present, loyalty and betrayal. Then the figure vanished into the haze of war, leaving only the echo of what had once been. As the battle raged, the loyalists of the 143rd Regiment fought with mechanical precision, their actions honed by months of unrelenting warfare. Soldiers fell around Voss, yet the line held. He moved tirelessly among them, pulling the wounded from debris, issuing commands, and reinforcing barricades. Each decision weighed heavily, balancing the need to preserve lives against the imperative to deny the rebels victory. The manufactorum had become a crucible, testing not just their strength, but their endurance, their resolve, and the limits of loyalty itself. Hours passed in a blur of fire, smoke, and blood. Explosions shook the ground, and the cries of the dying mingled with the roar of artillery. The city itself seemed to respond, its streets groaning under the weight of destruction, its ruins echoing the agony of the men and women defending it. Voss's thoughts turned repeatedly to the brass key in his pocket, a symbol of the final choice awaiting him. The city could not hold forever. Every breath, every heartbeat, every life spent in defense brought Krieg closer to a precipice from which there would be no return. By mid-afternoon, the assault had intensified. Rebel siege engines hammered the manufactorum walls, each strike threatening to collapse the already battered structure. The Loyalists fought back with disciplined fire, but exhaustion and dwindling supplies began to take their toll. Voss moved among the barricades, directing the defense, offering what encouragement he could, though his own heart was heavy with the knowledge that the end was near. In a rare moment of quiet, Voss found himself in a ruined hallway, speaking briefly with Sergeant Calden. "They're relentless," Calden said, his voice low, almost a whisper behind his mask. "They'll never tire, and we can't hold forever." Voss nodded, his hand brushing the brass key. "No," he said quietly, "but we endure. That is what Krieg demands. That is what we owe the Emperor." Night fell, and the fires of war painted the city in a surreal light, shadows stretching long across the broken streets. The Loyalists consolidated their defences, tending to the wounded and reinforcing barricades where possible. The manufactorum still stood, though battered and scarred. Voss ascended to an observation point, surveying the burning horizon. Somewhere in the distance, Hauer's forces regrouped, preparing for another assault, each wave more desperate and ruthless than the last. Voss's thoughts turned to the brass key once more, the final instrument of judgment and destruction. Every battle fought, every barricade held, every life sacrificed had led to this moment. Krieg's fate, and that of its loyal defenders, would soon be sealed by a choice that carried the weight of loyalty, betrayal, and survival. He looked out across the city, the twisted remains of hab blocks and manufactorums stretching to the horizon, smoke and fire mingling with the poisoned clouds above. Krieg waited, and so did its defenders. The crucible of loyalty, fire, and sacrifice was far from over, and the dawn of reckoning approached with relentless inevitability. The city of Krieg was cloaked in an eerie silence before the storm of battle resumed, the streets littered with the remnants of countless skirmishes. Captain Erich Voss moved through the manufactorum, his boots echoing across the steel floors as he observed the grim work of his soldiers. The 143rd Regiment, though battered and exhausted, remained steadfast, their gas masks reflecting the flickering light of distant fires. Each man and woman had become a shadow of endurance, their loyalty honed to a razor's edge through weeks of unrelenting conflict. Reports filtered in from the scouts stationed along the perimeter. Hauer's forces were consolidating, bringing in heavier artillery and armoured transports. Their movements were calculated, precise, a reminder of the traitor commander's knowledge of loyalist tactics. Voss felt a pang of bitter recognition. Hauer knew Krieg's weaknesses as intimately as Voss did, and he exploited them without hesitation. The betrayal burned still, deeper each time Voss considered the man who had once been his comrade, his friend, his brother in arms. The manufactorum's interior had been fortified to its limits. Barricades of steel girders, twisted metal, and the remnants of fallen machinery now blocked every entrance. Soldiers moved methodically through the hallways, distributing ammunition, checking weapons, and tending to the wounded. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of burning promethium, mingling with the ever-present haze that clung to every surface. By mid-morning, the assault began anew. Siege engines roared in the distance, their shells hurling fire and destruction toward the manufactorum. Voss took his place at the front line, las pistol in hand, directing fire with meticulous precision. Loyalists fired in disciplined volleys, the bursts of light and heat cutting down the rebels as they pressed forward. Grenades tore through enemy ranks, their explosions throwing men into the smoky air, but still the enemy advanced, relentless and unyielding. Amid the chaos, Voss caught sight of Hauer again, moving through the battlefield like a phantom. The traitor commander's presence was a wound to Voss's mind, each encounter a reminder of trust betrayed and loyalty shattered. The memories of their shared past, the campaigns fought side by side, the victories and the losses, were twisted now into bitter reminders of what had been lost. Yet, despite the personal anguish, Voss's focus remained on the defense, on holding the manufactorum at all costs. Hours bled into one another. Explosions rocked the structure, dust and debris filling the air, mingling with the smoke of fires that consumed nearby ruins. The Loyalists fought with the precision of a well-oiled machine, every movement calculated, every action deliberate. Yet the cost was mounting. Bodies piled in the streets and hallways, lives sacrificed to hold a city that seemed to demand nothing but suffering in return. In a brief lull, Voss moved to the central command post. Maps of the city lay spread across a steel table, Vox lines hissing and sparking with static as reports continued to stream in. Lieutenant Marin approached, his expression grim. "They're coordinating attacks from multiple directions now," he said. "Hauer is not just testing us. He's probing for weaknesses, for the exact point where Krieg will finally break." Voss's hand tightened around the brass key in his pocket. The time for decisions approached, the weight of inevitability pressing against him like the walls of the manufactorum themselves. He could feel the city's pulse through the steel beneath his boots, each tremor a reminder of the fragility of their defense. Krieg had endured centuries of war and betrayal, and now its legacy would be tested again, in fire and ash. As night fell, the rebels prepared for yet another wave. Fires from collapsed buildings painted the streets in eerie hues, the smoke casting long, shifting shadows across the barricades. Voss walked among his soldiers, offering what words of encouragement he could, though the gravity of the coming night pressed on every heart. Each man, each woman understood that the dawn might bring victory or annihilation. Above the manufactorum, the clouds churned and roiled, heavy with the promise of more fire, more destruction. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, their resolve hardening in the face of overwhelming odds. Voss stood among them, the brass key a constant weight in his pocket, a silent promise of the choices that would soon decide the fate of the city. The crucible of loyalty, fire and sacrifice had entered its final phase, and Krieg's last stand was approaching with relentless certainty. The dawn broke over Krieg in muted tones of grey and red, filtered through the smoke that clung stubbornly to the city. Captain Erich Voss moved through the streets of the manufactorum district, boots crunching on rubble, eyes scanning the horizon. The city was a graveyard of steel and ash, yet within its ruins, the 143rd Regiment continued to move with grim determination. Every man and woman bore the marks of relentless combat, soot-streaked uniforms, scorched respirators, and haunted eyes. But the pulse of loyalty beat strong, binding them to one another and to the city they had sworn to defend. Reports from scouts arrived in fragmented bursts through static-laden Vox channels. Hauer's forces were reorganizing, bringing fresh reinforcements and heavier siege engines. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to exploit Krieg's vulnerabilities. Every strike a reminder of the traitor commander's intimate knowledge of the loyalist defense. Voss's jaw tightened. Betrayal was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing force on the streets of his city, shaping every decision he made. Within the manufactorum, the loyalists worked tirelessly. Barricades were reinforced with twisted metal and debris. Weapons were distributed, and wounded soldiers were tended to with grim efficiency. The air was thick with the scent of blood, oil, and burning promethium, a haze that clung to every surface and seeped into the lungs of those who fought. Each breath was a reminder of mortality, and yet each heartbeat carried the weight of duty and loyalty that had kept Krieg alive through centuries of hardship. By mid-morning, the assault resumed with terrifying intensity. Rebel siege engines fired in unison, sending molten shells and explosive rounds crashing into the manufacturum's walls. Voss took his position at a reinforced barricade, las pistol in hand, and directed the defense with calm precision. Bursts of laser fire tore through the advancing enemy, grenades detonated in calculated arcs, and yet the rebels pressed forward, relentless in their pursuit of the city's destruction. Amid the maelstrom, Voss's eyes found Hauer again, moving like a spectre among his troops, orchestrating the assault with ruthless efficiency. Memories of shared campaigns, victories, and hard-won battles flickered in Voss's mind, now twisted into bitter reminders of loyalty broken. The sight of Hauer was a physical ache, a wound deeper than any last bolt could inflict. Yet Voss forced himself to focus on the defense, on holding every inch of the manufactorum, on preserving the lives of those still alive. Hours blurred together in a continuous storm of fire and smoke. Explosions shook the floors, steel groaned under the assault, and cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of artillery. Every corner, every hallway, every barricade became a battlefield, each defended with the precision and discipline that defined the soldiers of Krieg. Yet the cost was ever increasing. Soldiers fell, the wounded outnumbered the healthy, and the manufactorum groaned under the relentless punishment. In a brief respite, Voss surveyed the central command post, where maps of the city and Vox channels tracked the movements of both loyalist and rebel forces. Lieutenant Marin approached, face smeared with soot and exhaustion. "Captain," he said, voice low, "they're preparing something new. Siege engines, heavier than before. They're concentrating fire on the southern wall. If they break through there..." Voss's hand brushed the brass key hidden in his coat, a tangible reminder of the final decision looming on the horizon. Krieg could endure assaults, repel attacks, and sacrifice lives, but it could not withstand endless waves without consequence. The city's pulse, measured in tremors of fire and steel, warned him that the moment of judgment was fast approaching. As evening fell, the city was bathed in an eerie glow of fire and smoke. Shadows stretched across barricades, twisted metal, and crumbling buildings. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering encouragement and issuing orders, but inside he was aware that endurance alone would not save them. The brass key was a promise, a warning, and soon it would demand action. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, hardened by fire and bound by loyalty. Outside, the rebels amassed for another wave, their numbers and ferocity undiminished by the day's losses. Voss stood tall amidst the ruin, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. The crucible of loyalty, fire, and sacrifice had reached its penultimate stage, and the reckoning for Krieg and its people was approaching with inexorable certainty. The morning light barely penetrated the thick, choking clouds over Krieg, casting the Manufacturum district in a dull, oppressive grey. Captain Eric Voss moved through the ruined streets, each step stirring dust and ash that had settled over shattered steel and broken masonry. The city had become a tomb and a battlefield simultaneously, its streets littered with the remnants of lives sacrificed in the name of loyalty. Yet, amidst the ruins, the men and women of the 143rd Regiment continued their grim work, reinforcing barricades, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the next wave of attacks. Each breath they drew was a silent testament to endurance, each heartbeat a fragile defiance against the inevitable. Reports streamed through the Vox channels, fragmented but urgent. Hauer's forces were reorganizing, bringing heavier artillery and mechanized transports into the western corridors. The traitor commander's intimate knowledge of Krieg's defenses allowed him to coordinate attacks with deadly efficiency, probing for weaknesses and seeking the exact point where resistance might falter. Voss's hand rested on the brass key concealed beneath his coat, a reminder of the ultimate decision looming over every action, every sacrifice, every soldier who still drew breath. Within the Manufacturum, soldiers worked with relentless precision, their movements choreographed by necessity and survival. Barricades of twisted steel, scorched machinery, and debris were reinforced. Weapons were checked and distributed, and the wounded were moved to safer positions. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of burning promethium. Dust and smoke clung to every surface, and the constant roar of artillery hammered through the walls, an unrelenting reminder of Krieg's fragility. By mid-morning, the rebels launched another wave. Siege engines hurled fire and destruction toward the Manufacturum's walls, the explosions shaking the floors and sending fragments of steel and stone into the streets. Voss took his position at a reinforced barricade, las pistol discharging in controlled bursts, directing fire with meticulous precision. The Loyalists responded with disciplined volleys, grenades exploding in arcs calculated to inflict maximum damage. Still, the rebels pressed forward, relentless, each wave testing the limits of endurance and resolve. Amidst the chaos, Voss glimpsed Hauer again, moving like a shadow through the battlefield, orchestrating destruction with methodical ruthlessness. Memories of shared victories and campaigns flashed in Voss's mind, now twisted into bitter reminders of loyalty shattered. The sight of Hauer was a constant gnawing ache, a wound that no lashbolt or shell could heal. Yet, despite the personal anguish, Voss remained focused on the defense, on every barricade, every corridor, every soldier whose life depended on his decisions. Hours passed in an unbroken blur of fire, smoke, and blood. Explosions shook the Manufacturum, steel groaned, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the constant thunder of artillery. Each hallway and barricade became a crucible, testing the soldiers' endurance, discipline, and loyalty. The cost was immense: fallen comrades, injured bodies, and the relentless strain of constant vigilance. But Krieg's defenders held, driven by duty and an unyielding will. As dusk approached, Voss moved to the central command post. Maps were spread across the steel table, Vox lines sparking with static as reports flowed in. Lieutenant Maren approached, face smeared with soot. "They've brought heavier siege engines and concentrated their fire on the southern wall. If they break through, the Manufacturum could collapse entirely," he said, voice low. Voss's fingers brushed the brass key. The decision weighed heavily, the promise of finality pressing against him like the steel walls surrounding the city. Krieg could endure assaults, repel attacks, and sacrifice lives, but its time was finite. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and every choice carried the weight of survival and destruction. As night fell, fires from distant ruins bathed the manufactorum in a hellish glow, smoke twisting through the streets like restless spirits. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering encouragement and issuing orders, yet aware that endurance alone might not be enough. The brass key was more than a symbol. It was the harbinger of the choices that would define the fate of the city and all who defended it. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, hardened by fire and bound by loyalty. Outside, the enemy massed once more, their ferocity and numbers undiminished by previous losses. Voss stood amidst the ruin, the weight of command pressing upon him. The crucible of loyalty, fire, and sacrifice had reached its next stage, and the final reckoning for Krieg and its people was drawing ever closer, relentless, and inevitable. The city of Krieg had become a furnace of smoke, fire, and steel, each street a testament to endurance and suffering. Captain Erik Voss moved through the manufactorum district with deliberate steps, his eyes scanning the rubble-strewn avenues for signs of the next rebel advance. The remnants of the 143rd Regiment worked tirelessly, reinforcing barricades, distributing ammunition, and tending to the wounded with a grim efficiency born of desperation and loyalty. Every breath, every heartbeat was a defiance against the unrelenting tide that sought to consume the city. Vox reports crackled through the command channels, fragmented but urgent. Hauer had intensified his efforts, bringing heavier artillery and mechanized transports to the northern corridors. Each assault was calculated, precise, and personal, a reflection of the traitor commander's intimate understanding of Krieg's defenses. Voss's hand brushed the brass key hidden beneath his coat, a constant reminder of the ultimate decision that loomed, the burden of choice pressing heavier with every passing hour. Inside the manufactorum, the loyalists moved with mechanical precision, their every action dictated by survival and discipline. Barricades of twisted metal, machinery, and debris were reinforced, weapons checked and redistributed, and the wounded relocated to safer positions. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of burning promethium, mingling with dust and smoke that clung to every surface. The constant thunder of artillery reverberated through the walls, a relentless reminder of the city's vulnerability and the stakes of every decision. By mid-morning, the rebels launched yet another assault. Siege engines roared to life, hurling molten shells that struck the manufactorum walls with devastating force. Explosions sent debris and fragments of steel flying, while Voss and his men fired disciplined volleys in response, las pistol and grenade alike, cutting through the advancing enemy ranks. Each wave tested the limits of endurance and resolve, forcing soldiers to move with precision and determination, their actions dictated as much by loyalty as by instinct. In the chaos, Voss caught sight of Hauer once more, moving with the cold efficiency of a master strategist, directing destruction with unflinching purpose. The memories of past camaraderie, campaigns fought side by side, and victories shared now twisted into bitter reminders of trust broken. Hauer's betrayal burned in Voss's chest, an ache that neither exhaustion nor adrenaline could dull. Yet despite the pain, Voss remained focused, directing his men, reinforcing barricades, and ensuring that no breach went undefended. Hours passed in a relentless blur. Explosions shook the manufactorum floors, Walls groaned under the weight of repeated bombardment, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of artillery. Every hallway, every barricade, every street corner became a crucible of loyalty and sacrifice, testing the endurance and discipline of the loyalists. The cost was immense: fallen comrades, injured bodies, and the strain of constant vigilance. But Krieg's defenders held firm, driven by duty, honor, and an unyielding will. As dusk fell, Voss ascended to a vantage point overlooking the Manufacturum district. Fires from distant ruins cast flickering light across the rubble-strewn streets, smoke twisting upward into the poisoned sky. Lieutenant Marin approached, his visor streaked with soot. They've concentrated their assault on the eastern wall. If they break through there... He hesitated, the weight of possibility heavy in his voice. Voss's hand rested on the brass key. The time for final decisions approached. Krieg could endure further assaults, repel waves of enemies, and sacrifice countless lives, but the city's strength had limits. Every decision carried the weight of life and death, loyalty and betrayal. The crucible of fire, smoke, and steel would soon demand an answer, and Voss knew that whatever choice he made would seal the fate of Krieg and its people. Night settled over the city, thick with smoke and the red glow of burning ruins. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering what words of encouragement he could, though the reality of the situation pressed heavily on every heart. The brass key in his pocket was more than a symbol. It was a promise, a warning, and a tool of reckoning. Outside, the enemy prepared once more, their numbers undiminished, their ferocity undeterred by previous losses. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, hardened by centuries of war and bound by loyalty. Captain Voss stood among them, the weight of command pressing on his shoulders. The crucible of loyalty, sacrifice, and fire had reached its penultimate stage, and the ultimate reckoning for the city and all who defended it drew inexorably closer, relentless and unavoidable. The first light of dawn struggled through the thick clouds over Krieg, casting the Manufacturum district in muted shades of grey and crimson. Captain Erich Voss moved carefully through the rubble-strewn streets, boots crunching on fragments of twisted metal and shattered masonry. The city bore the scars of endless assault, collapsed walls, scorched buildings, and the silent corpses of those who had fallen defending it. But within this desolation, the survivors of the 143rd Regiment laboured tirelessly. Each movement was precise, each action measured, every breath a fragile defiance against the encroaching tide of Hauer's forces. Reports crackled through the Vox channels with urgency. Howard concentrated his forces for a decisive push, bringing heavier siege engines and mechanized units into the northern corridors. The traitor commander's knowledge of Krieg's defenses made every attack calculated and precise, probing for the exact point where loyalty might falter and resistance break. Voss's hand rested on the brass key, concealed beneath his coat, a tangible reminder that the ultimate decision loomed, the weight of command pressing down with crushing inevitability. Inside the Manufacturum, the Loyalists moved with disciplined precision, reinforcing barricades of steel, debris, and the remains of fallen machinery. Weapons were checked, ammunition distributed, and the wounded tended to with grim efficiency. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of burning promethium. Dust and smoke clung to every surface, searing the lungs of those who breathed it, while the constant thunder of artillery reverberated through the walls, a relentless reminder of the city's fragility and the stakes of every action. By mid-morning, the rebels launched their assault, Siege engines roared, hurling fire and destruction toward the manufacturing walls. Explosions rocked the floors and sent fragments of steel and stone flying across the streets. Voss took his position at a barricade, las pistol discharging in measured bursts, directing fire and reinforcing weak points. Grenades tore through the ranks of the enemy, yet still they pressed forward, relentless and unyielding. Every breach tested the endurance, skill, and resolve of Krieg's defenders, forcing them to move with precision and unwavering loyalty. Amidst the chaos, Voss caught sight of Hauer again, moving like a spectre among his forces, orchestrating devastation with unflinching efficiency. Memories of past camaraderie and shared victories flashed in Voss's mind, now twisted into bitter reminders of trust shattered. The betrayal was an ache that no adrenaline could numb, yet Voss remained focused on the defense, ensuring that no corridor, no barricade, and no soldier fell undefended. Hours passed in unbroken turmoil. Explosions shook the manufactorum. Steel groaned under relentless bombardment, and cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of artillery. Every street, hallway, and barricade became a crucible, testing endurance, discipline, and loyalty. The cost was immense. Lives lost, bodies injured, and minds pushed to the brink. Yet the defenders of Krieg held their ground, bound by duty and unyielding will. As dusk approached, Voss ascended to a vantage point overlooking the manufactorum district. Fires from distant ruins cast long, flickering shadows, smoke rising in restless spirals toward the poisoned sky. Lieutenant Maren approached, visor streaked with soot. "They're focusing all their efforts on the southern wall," he said, voice tense. "If they break through..." Voss's fingers brushed the brass key. The moment of final decisions drew near. Krieg could endure assaults and repel waves of enemies, but its strength was finite. Every action, every choice carried the weight of life and death, loyalty and betrayal. The crucible of fire, loyalty, and sacrifice demanded an answer, and Voss knew that when it came, it would seal the fate of Krieg and all who defended it. Night fell over the city, thick with smoke and the red glow of burning ruins. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering encouragement and issuing orders, though the heavy truth pressed upon every heart. The brass key was more than a symbol. It was the instrument of destiny, the harbinger of the choices that would determine Krieg's ultimate fate. Outside, the rebels gathered for another assault, their numbers undiminished, their ferocity undeterred by previous losses. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, hardened by centuries of war, bound by loyalty and duty. Captain Voss stood amidst the ruin, the weight of command pressing upon him. The crucible of loyalty, fire, and sacrifice had reached its most critical stage, and the ultimate reckoning for the city and its people drew inexorably closer, relentless and unavoidable. The sky over Krieg had turned a deep, oppressive red, thick clouds swirling like a living entity above the manufactorum district. Captain Eric Voss moved along the fractured streets, the remnants of rubble crunching beneath his boots. Fires from shattered buildings cast flickering shadows across barricades and collapsed machinery, illuminating the faces of soldiers hardened by endless conflict. The 143rd Regiment, though battered and weary, held their positions with a discipline born of both loyalty and desperation. Every heartbeat carried the weight of survival, every breath a defiance against the encroaching tide of Hauer's forces. Reports arrived in fragmented bursts through static-laden Vox channels. Hauer's assault had intensified, his mechanized units and heavy artillery concentrating fire on the southern wall of the manufactorum. Each strike was precise, designed to exploit weaknesses and fracture morale. Voss's hand rested on the brass key concealed beneath his coat, the weight of it a constant reminder of the decision that awaited him. Every choice now carried the potential to save or doom Krieg entirely. The manufactorum itself groaned under the relentless pounding of artillery and siege engines. Barricades of steel, machinery and debris were reinforced with grim efficiency, weapons checked and redistributed, and the wounded moved to safer positions. Smoke and dust clung to every surface, mingling with the acrid scent of burning promethium and blood. The roar of explosions reverberated through the streets, a ceaseless rhythm of destruction that pressed against every nerve. By mid-morning, the rebels launched a coordinated assault unlike any before. Siege engines unleashed torrents of fire, their impact sending chunks of wall and steel flying. Voss positioned himself at the forefront, Laspistol discharging in measured bursts, directing fire and shoring up defenses where needed. Grenades tore through enemy ranks, yet the assault continued, unrelenting in its intensity. Each advance, each wave, tested the limits of endurance and loyalty, forcing the soldiers of Krieg to stand unbroken against overwhelming odds. Amidst the chaos, Voss glimpsed Hauer moving through the battlefield like a shadow, orchestrating destruction with ruthless precision. Memories of past camaraderie and victories haunted him now, twisted into bitter reminders of betrayal. The sight of Hauer burned in Voss's chest, a wound deeper than any physical injury. Yet he could not allow grief or rage to cloud his judgment. The defense of Krieg demanded focus, discipline, and unyielding resolve. Hours bled into one another. Explosions shook the manufactorum. Steel groaned under the punishment, and cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of artillery. Each street, hallway, and barricade became a crucible, testing endurance, skill, and loyalty. The cost was enormous: fallen comrades, injured bodies, and minds pushed to the edge, but the defenders held firm, bound by duty, honor, and unflinching will. As dusk approached, Voss climbed to a vantage point overlooking the manufactorum district. Fires from distant ruins painted the streets in a hellish glow, smoke rising in restless columns toward the darkened sky. Lieutenant Marin approached, face streaked with soot. "They've focused all their forces on the southern wall," he said. "If it falls—" His voice faltered under the weight of implication. Voss's fingers brushed the brass key. The time for action had come. Krieg could endure further assaults, but its strength was finite. Every decision now carried irreversible consequences. Loyalty and betrayal, survival and death balanced on the edge of a blade. The crucible of fire, loyalty, and sacrifice demanded a choice, and Voss knew that when it came, it would determine the fate of every man and woman who still drew breath within the city. Night descended over Krieg, thick with smoke, fire, and the acrid scent of destruction. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering encouragement and issuing orders, though each word carried the weight of finality. The brass key was no longer merely a symbol. It was the instrument of judgment, the harbinger of destiny. Outside, the rebels massed for another wave, their ferocity unbroken, their numbers undiminished. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, steeled by centuries of warfare and bound by loyalty. Captain Voss stood amidst the ruin, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. The crucible of loyalty, sacrifice, and fire had reached its apex, and the ultimate reckoning for the city and all who defended it drew near, inexorable and absolute. The sky above Krieg had turned an unnatural shade of crimson, the clouds swirling like the smoke of 1,000 fires, reflecting the chaos that had consumed the Manufacturum district. Captain Eric Voss moved through the ruined streets, boots crunching over twisted metal and shattered masonry, each step echoing with the weight of command. Fires from collapsed buildings cast flickering shadows across barricades and ruined machinery, illuminating the determined faces of the 143rd Regiment. Though battered and weary, they held their ground with unwavering discipline, each heartbeat a testament to loyalty, each breath a defiance against the unrelenting force of Hauer's rebellion. Vox reports crackled urgently through the command channels. Hauer had concentrated his forces for a final, decisive push, deploying the heaviest siege engines and mechanized units against the southern wall. Each strike was precise, designed to exploit weaknesses, fracture morale, and test the limits of Krieg's endurance. Voss's hand rested on the brass key concealed beneath his coat, a constant reminder of the choice that would decide the city's fate. Every moment was a balance between life and death, loyalty and betrayal, victory and annihilation. The Manufacturum groaned under relentless bombardment. Barricades of steel, debris and machinery were reinforced with grim efficiency. Weapons were checked, ammunition distributed, and the wounded moved to safer positions. Smoke and dust clung to every surface, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of burning promethium. Explosions thundered through the streets, shaking walls and floors alike, an unyielding drumbeat of destruction. By mid-morning, the rebels launched their final assault. Siege engines fired in unison, tearing walls apart, sending fragments of steel and masonry into the streets. Voss positioned himself at the forefront, las pistol discharging in measured bursts, directing fire and reinforcing defenses wherever the enemy threatened to breach. Grenades tore through advancing ranks, yet still the rebels pressed forward, unrelenting and merciless. Each wave tested the limits of endurance, the discipline of the soldiers, and the depth of loyalty that bound them to Krieg. Amid the chaos, Voss saw Hauer once more, moving with the precision of a predator among his troops, orchestrating destruction with methodical ruthlessness. Memories of past camaraderie and shared victories twisted into bitter reminders of trust broken. The sight of Hauer burned in Voss's chest, a wound deeper than any last bolt could inflict. Yet grief and rage could not sway him. The defense of Krieg demanded focus, strategy, and unflinching resolve. Hours blurred into a continuous storm of fire, smoke, and blood. Explosions shook the Manufacturum. Steel groaned under unrelenting assault, and cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of artillery. Every street, hallway, and barricade became a crucible of loyalty, skill, and sacrifice. The cost was staggering. Fallen comrades, injured bodies, and minds strained to the breaking point. But the defenders of Krieg stood firm, bound by duty, honor, and an unyielding will. As dusk fell, Voss ascended to a vantage point overlooking the southern wall. Fires from ruined buildings bathed the streets in a hellish glow, smoke rising in restless spirals toward the darkened sky. Lieutenant Marin approached, visor streaked with soot and exhaustion. "They've concentrated all. Forces here, Captain. If they break through..." His voice faltered under the weight of the impending reality. Voss's fingers brushed the brass key. The moment of ultimate decision had arrived. Krieg could endure no further assaults without dire consequence. Every action now bore the weight of irreversible fate. Loyalty and betrayal, survival and death, victory and annihilation balanced on a knife's edge. The crucible of fire, loyalty, and sacrifice demanded a choice, and Voss knew that when it came, it would seal the destiny of every soldier and every soul within the city. Night descended fully over Krieg, thick with smoke, fire, and the acrid scent of destruction. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering what words of encouragement he could, though the gravity of the moment pressed on every heart. The brass key was no longer simply a symbol. It was the instrument of reckoning, the harbinger of destiny. Outside, the rebels massed for their final wave, their numbers unbroken, their ferocity undiminished. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, hardened by centuries of war and bound by unwavering loyalty. Captain Voss stood amidst the ruin, the weight of command pressing heavily on his shoulders. The crucible of loyalty, fire, and sacrifice had reached its apex, and the ultimate reckoning for the city and all who defended it was upon them, inevitable and absolute. The city of Krieg lay in a landscape of fire, smoke, and ruin. The Manufacturum district, once a monument to human ingenuity and perseverance, had been reduced to shattered steel and crumbling masonry. Captain Eric Voss moved through the streets, his boots crunching over the rubble of fallen buildings and the bodies of those who had given their lives in defense of the city. Fires flickered across the walls, casting long shadows over the exhausted faces of the surviving soldiers, each one bearing the scars of relentless combat. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, the acrid scent of burning promethium, and the dust of centuries of war, mingling to form a suffocating shroud that pressed upon every living soul. Reports crackled through the static of the Vox channels. Hauer had concentrated all remaining forces for a final, decisive push against the southern wall. Siege engines fired with relentless precision, hurling molten shells and explosive rounds that tore chunks of steel and masonry from the barricades. The enemy pressed forward with unyielding determination, each soldier driven by a mixture of hatred, ambition, and the dark promise of victory. Voss's hand rested on the brass key, its weight a constant reminder of the final choice that would determine Krieg's fate. The Loyalists, though exhausted and bloodied, held their ground with grim discipline. Barricades were reinforced, weapons distributed, and the wounded tended to with meticulous care. Each volley of las fire, each detonated grenade, each strategic maneuver was executed with precision born of desperation. Yet the cost was apparent. Fallen comrades littered the streets, their sacrifice etched into the memory of every survivor. Every heartbeat was a reminder of mortality, yet also of the unbroken will that bound them to Krieg. By mid-morning, the rebels had reached the Manufacturum's final defensive lines. Hauer, moving among his forces like a spectre, orchestrated the assault with cruel efficiency. Memories of past camaraderie and shared victories tormented Voss, now twisted into bitter reminders of loyalty betrayed. The sight of Hauer's commanding figure, unyielding and ruthless, was a wound deeper than any last bolt could inflict. Yet there was no time for grief. Krieg demanded focus, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Hours passed in a relentless torrent of fire, smoke, and blood. Explosions shook the Manufacturum, steel groaned under the repeated bombardment, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the deafening roar of artillery. Every street, hallway, and barricade became a crucible of loyalty and sacrifice. The defenders of Krieg held their ground, despite staggering losses, driven by duty, honor, and an unflinching will. As dusk fell, Voss ascended to the highest vantage point he could find amidst the ruins. Fires cast a hellish glow across the city, smoke rising in restless spirals toward the darkened sky. Lieutenant Marin approached, visor streaked with soot and exhaustion. "Captain, this is it, the final assault. If they break through here..." His words faltered, heavy with the inevitability of fate. Voss's fingers brushed the brass key, the symbol and instrument of the ultimate choice. Krieg could endure no more assaults without catastrophic consequence. Every decision now carried irreversible weight. Loyalty and betrayal, survival and death, victory and annihilation balanced precariously on a single act. The crucible of fire, sacrifice, and devotion demanded a choice, and Voss knew that this moment would define the destiny of every soldier, every soul, and the very city itself. Night fully descended over Krieg, shrouding the ruins in smoke and the red glow of unquenched fires. Voss moved among his soldiers, offering words of encouragement, though the gravity of the situation pressed upon every heart. The brass key was no longer a symbol. It was the harbinger of destiny. Outside, the rebels prepared their final push, their numbers and ferocity undiminished, their resolve absolute. Krieg's defenders braced themselves, hardened by centuries of war, bound by unbroken loyalty. Captain Eric Voss stood amidst the ruins, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon where the final battle would be fought. The crucible of loyalty, fire, and sacrifice had reached its ultimate stage. The city, its people, and its defenders were poised on the knife edge of fate, where courage, betrayal, and destiny would collide in a storm that would echo through the annals of history. And as the first shots of the final assault rang out across the fractured streets, Voss understood the truth that had been born across centuries of conflict. Immortality was a curse, loyalty a burden, and the cost of empire, the lives of those who carried its weight, was measured in fire, blood, and ash.